Welcome to the Chain Mountain Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Ackerman. In today's episode, I sit down with Leo Naboyshchikov, Vice President of Space Operations at SE01E12. SE01E12 is a trusted services provider for both the federal and private sector, supporting critical missions across the defense, intelligence, homeland security, health, and space markets. Leo shares his unique journey from a counterterrorism expert to the aerospace industry, emphasizing the importance of leadership under pressure, the evolution of decision-making, and the significance of servant leadership. We discuss managing distributed teams in a post-COVID world, the necessity of connecting teams to a mission, and the importance of soft skills in the technical fields. We also have a great discussion about the often overlooked roles in the aerospace industry, the impact of AI, and finally, Leo offers great advice for young leaders looking to enter the exciting field of launching stuff into space. Leo, thank you so much for joining the Chain Mountain Podcast. I'll tell you, I am really excited about this discussion. You are a really, really interesting guy and have had some incredible experiences. And you are a very unique professional. I don't often interview guys who kind of have your experience, but also, do the types of things that you're doing right now. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I want to jump right into it. So you went from when you right out of school got into counterterrorism in Southeast Asia, all the way to the U.S. space program, right? I'm really interested to understand how those early high pressure experiences shaped your leadership style and philosophy now that you're in the space program.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those early years in counterterrorism really shaped how I think about leadership generally under pressure. In that world, you really had to learn quickly that you can't rely on the top-down control. Situations, they change really fast. Information a lot of times is imperfect. And the people closest to the problem usually are the ones that see the truth first. And overall, that really taught me that you need to build teams that can operate independently, but also in alignment where everyone understands intent and not just instruction. And I think it's the same in space operations today. The stakes are very different for sure, but the principle is the same. I'd say clarity of purpose, distributed ownership, and calm in uncertainty. So I'd say in those high pressure environments or experiences, they made me comfortable leading through trust and transparency rather than just a standard command and compliance structure. And I think my role largely is to set direction, remove barriers, and make sure people have the confidence and the context to act decisively when it really counts. I think it's interesting when I first started out in a leadership role, I was kind of just thrown into it. I didn't read any books on leadership or best practices. I was doing it very largely trial by fire. You work with the team on a field operation and you try one method and you realize, that really is not going to work out at all. Team doesn't respond, the situation doesn't respond well, and you don't have a lot of room for error. And I feel like I tried that for a really long time. And I started to naturally come to a conclusion of what is now known as servant leadership. But at the time, I think I was just kind of trying to figure it out. And that trial by fire really allowed me to realize what works for me naturally versus trying to adapt others' life stories to my own. And I think that's kind of how I got to where I'm at now and how I view my leadership style.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about decision making, right? And when you're in a really high pressure environment, lives are on the line, right? And you've got to be able to trust the people on your team to be able to provide you, good information, right? Like you said, that is a very different leadership style, right? And ironically, it is a little bit. There's kind of the commanding leadership style, or you follow my orders, versus a little bit about what you kind of have experienced, and maybe there's a misconception amongst the American public. They're watching Netflix shows, right? And guys are giving orders. Whereas, today in a lot of these high pressure situations, there is that different philosophy that I think is kind of the servant leadership, or so it's called today, that's a little bit different. What did you learn about that decision making process and that trust kind of that still apply, in your job today and what you're doing in aerospace?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. When real lives are on the line, you really learn that decision making has to be both precise and human, and you can't take the human out of this concept. Precision matters because in some moments, ambiguity can really cost you dearly, including lives. But I also learned that precision doesn't come from just sitting in a room far away from the problem. It comes from being in the field, seeing the reality up close, and understanding how your decisions can ripple through the people that are actually executing your decisions. And that's where I think trust starts to be built. When your teams see you, that you're present, you're listening, and also steady under pressure, they develop the confidence not just in you, but the system that you're all a part of and the system you're trying to build. And I think in space today, that lesson holds true. I think it holds true in any industry. The technology is different, but the human element of it, the human component, is really the same, being calm in uncertainty. And that comes from a shared understanding, earned trust, and I'd say largely a disciplined execution.
Yeah. So one of the challenges that I think a lot of modern leaders now face, right, post COVID, a lot of people now stay home. A lot of people, obviously, that historically have worked in the global context, you had to get on a plane to go see your team in Asia or in Europe. Um, Now that's changed, right? We can simply turn on Teams and send somebody an invite, and all of a sudden I have a face to face relationship. Um, that differs a little bit from back in the day when you were call it in the field, and you have an appreciation for being in the field. I mean, how do you translate that being in the field experience, and juxtapose that with kind of how you need to manage distributed teams now, right? Teams you may have globally or teams you
Yeah,
have in other parts of the nation, right?
yeah. Teams are naturally more distributed. I think that's the reality of how we operate nowadays. And I think, as you mentioned, especially true after the COVID years when remote and hybrid environments essentially became the norm in a lot of industries. Not all industries, and kind of depends on how you look at it, but it really did become the norm. And managing that kind of spread out organization is always going to be a challenge. And I can't say that someone has solved it. But I think the core lesson from being in the field still very much applies to go where your people are, to understand the environment and show that you value what your folks are seeing on the ground and what you're seeing on the ground. I make it a point to visit our teams in their own context when I can. We have a very distributed division within the company with folks kind of all over the country. And I make sure to go there because that's where you see how work really happens. I mean, I think this really is probably self-evident to a lot of people, but you see the culture, the friction points, the small wins that don't always make it into a report that then you're reading at a leadership level. And I think I
Right.
I really appreciate and like to focus on the small wins that the teams have. And you kind of just miss that when you are not there with folks. And I think folks really appreciate that as well. I've also been extremely fortunate within my current position to have extremely strong program and project managers, very strong leadership team. These are people who are very mission focused, and I trust them to lead their teams and make the decisions with the same exact intent that I would. And that trust allows us to be able to move fast, to stay aligned, even when I'm not in the same place as where those folks are. And lastly, I would say be available. I mean, I think this is something that I've learned over the years and I'm still kind of learning, but I hear a lot of folks say, I have an open door policy. But I think, we have to live that truly from a leadership perspective. So for a while, I actually had office hours, virtual office hours, where anyone in the
Right,
country,
right.
anyone that's within our division, can attend office hours for hour to 2 hours a week, and they can ask me any single question. I was in that room whether people were there or not, and they can bring up any topic at all. And I think that availability really helps people. And I know that when I've had leaders that have been available, that also really helped me to be able to adjust on the fly, but also feel a connection to folks.
Yeah, and a level of trust you're building with them that you can be transparent, right? Those types
Absolutely.
of settings, right? Which is really really important. You've also described kind of your discovery of the servant leadership on your own. Before it was trendy, and I'm curious to understand how does that fit within kind of the culture of NASA and other contractors that you see. Similar kind of approach, and we talked about just that, the distribution of your team within your organization. But now you're not only dealing with your organization, you've got NASA and all the other contractors that are working on a set of projects, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I actually might approach that question from a slightly different angle, if you don't mind. I saw
Yeah,
a
yeah.
post recently from a very well-known COO on LinkedIn who said that you can't have an effective project or operations leader in IT unless they've worked in IT themselves, that they need to be an IT SME in order to be a good leader. And there were just
Right.
dozens upon dozens of people agreeing with this perspective. And I know that's actually probably a prominent perspective. I find it interesting because I don't completely agree with this mindset. Um, for sure, having the same technical background as your team helps you speak the same language, you understand the complexity. But leadership isn't just about shared expertise. It's about creating the conditions for people to succeed, right? And some of the other things that I've talked about earlier. And in my experience, whether you're leading a partner nation team or a space operations program, a software project, the fundamentals are the same. Helping remove barriers, building that trust, making sure people feel like their contributions actually matter. That's really what this style of leadership is to me. It's much less about hierarchy and more about enabling others to operate at their best. And I think that fits perfectly within the space ecosystem generally, depending on the program or whether it's on the commercial, civil, or defense side of space. You got an incredible blend of contractors, engineers, scientists, operators. Everyone's an expert in something, and the leader's job is not to be the smartest person in the room or to be a rocket scientist like the folks you might be managing. It's to make
Yeah.
sure that the smartest people have what they need to deliver on the mission.
Yeah. And I want to dig into your comment right there. Deliver on the mission itself, right? Because that's another unique kind of characteristic of, I think, your work, is that it is mission focused, right? And a lot of organizations and companies, there's a wide variety of projects that everybody's working on, right? And oftentimes it's not
Yeah.
clear to a lot of people in the organization what is the mission, right? I mean, I've walked into many many clients before and had them asked for what is your strategy, right? And you get a different answer as many different people as you ask, right? So I think that's a unique component that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. But I also profoundly agree with your take on the fact that I don't have to be an SME to be able to lead a part of an organization. I think the evidence to that is what makes a great CEO. CEOs can't possibly have complete command and control over every single area facet of what it is they do. They may grow up in a certain area, be it sales or supply chain or operations or financial leadership. But at the end of the day, they need to have some knowledge, but they can't have complete control, right? So I think that says a lot to, you know, there is more to it than ultimately just being an SME in a particular area. But speak to me a little bit about that, mission focus, if you don't mind. I'm really interested to kind of hear you talk a little bit more about how that colors, your leadership style, as well as kind of, how you can keep people focused on their day-to-day jobs.
Yeah, one of the things that I really began to love about working in this industry, especially with the teams that we have either in Huntsville or New Orleans or Los Angeles, is the sheer pride that people take in their mission. And you see it in the engineers who spend 20, 30, 40 years dedicated to you know, getting something launched, getting a rocket launched, and they want to see that through. And these are people who have devoted their entire careers to advancing human spaceflight or working on a satellite system or what have you. And they're they're not motivated by titles or recognition as the same way that I think we see it, quote unquote corporate world. They're really motivated by the mission itself, and they've weathered, program changes and budget shifts and leadership turnovers, and we're seeing a lot of that today. But they've stayed focused on the long game, seeing humanity take that next step, which is so fascinating. And I think there's a real lesson in that. It's, in a time where personal ambition often takes center stage for a lot of folks, these teams remind me that true fulfillment comes from being part of something much larger than yourself, from knowing your work with can quite literally help propel others farther than we've ever gone, sending people to space. How cool of a concept is that? And personal ambition will still always exist as a concept. That's a human concept, right? But being part of a team and being part of a mission is something that, we should strive for. And again, I don't think it's something that there's a magic formula for when we look at this, but recognizing this as leaders, I think is very important. How do we build that environment? How do we build out a mission for folks to focus on? Can we understand what their core goals are, what their core values are? How do we connect that to the mission? And the mission doesn't have to be the same exact mission that a company has for growth. This might be something that they're working on individually. And how do we bring it on an individual basis as well? So again, I don't think there's this magic formula that we have, but I think as leaders to understand that is really the first step.
So if you kind of deconstruct a little bit of that methodology that you might use, say, I have an overall mission, right? And I've got people who in general are bought into that mission. Um, how are you able to deconstruct the components of that mission into to getting the individuals to buy into that? Is that something that they come already wired to do, right? Are they already there? Or is that something that you need to kind of help guide and occasionally put guardrails around?
I think it's probably a little bit of all, but I'll use Artemis as an example. When I think about Artemis and really all the other space programs out there between civil, commercial, and defense, I think what really stands out to me is persistence. I mean, this program has been decades in the making. It has gone through many redesigns, funding challenges, leadership changes, and yet the mission has stayed alive, the main mission of Artemis, because I think the people have not lost sight on why it matters. And I think this is really a true concept for countless programs, across this industry. And I think that's something that actually I think corporately teams can really learn from. Long-term success isn't about constant excitement. It's about keeping people connected to that purpose. The priorities will shift, organizations will evolve as we see. But if your team believes in what they're building and they trust the leadership to stay steady through those changes, they'll keep showing up and they'll keep doing their best work. I think that's a concept that's true in both space and business. Leaders' job is to keep that sense of purpose visible and to remind people, especially during the slow or tough stretches, that their efforts do fit into something bigger. It's how you can sustain momentum for years, not just months. And I think again, we kind of have to, as leaders, understand what is that mission? How does that connect to our people? Understanding, what people's core values are, what their core competencies are, and how you can connect them, keep people driven. What one thing that I've really prided myself on is working with all the folks within our division on learning opportunities for themselves, seeing where they can grow, and maybe there's opportunities for growth that they haven't even identified that fits into a mission for themselves or for the division. And I think that creating an atmosphere of learning has been really, really key. It could be anyone, wherever they are on the spectrum of their careers, having that feeling that you're going to get supported in learning, and it might be a career change. It might be something where you've decided that I just want to understand how AI works. I want to understand this other component of people I work with. But that gives people a better grounding in order to work closer with you.
Yeah, one of the interesting things as I was sitting here thinking about your philosophy there, and the concept of a mission is, there is a certain finality to it, right? And I think what corporates struggle with is kind of keeping that energy long term, right? So it's how do I create a strategy? How do I get everybody excited so that they stay energized, through a longer period of time. But I mean, I'll use the example of a guy. My sons love this YouTuber named Mark Rober, right? Who worked on one of the Mars missions, the Mars landing missions. He's super great young guy, very, very interesting, and has like a real energy about him. And he does these great like science shows now. So that's kind of what his deal is. And not too recently he got to go and like watch it finally land, right? So they spent all of this, a significant portion of his youth working on this program. It launched, and then years later, he gets to go and watch and see what happens, right? Did something, did we mess something up, right? Did we forget to, convert, uh, you know, imperial to metric, right? Which I think was one of the famous issues on one of the previous, Mars landings. Speak to me a little bit about kind of, how you see the next kind of generation getting energized about space, and why is it only that 1 in 5 aerospace employees right now are under 35, right? I mean, why? This is super interesting stuff. Why do you think they're not, the next generation isn't flooding into these careers?
Yeah, and that's a big topic that I think is being kind of discussed across this industry and interrelated industries. But to first to your point that there's a finality to a lot of these programs. The programs themselves, maybe from a government perspective, there's a finality of this thing launched, we're done with this work. But when you look at it from a science perspective, you look at it from a technology perspective, the work, I would say, is never done. And I think that's what one of the things that does make this work so extremely fascinating. For me, I'm always continually fascinated by the what else, what's next. And those discussions are being had many, many years beforehand. And I think that really should be very exciting for a lot of folks that are interested in this type of industry. I think part of it is that the space industry doesn't make itself as accessible or visible to younger talent as some of the newer tech fields. If you're earlier in your career, or just starting out in your career, it's easy to see a clear path in software or startups, or you name it. These worlds move fast and they talk loudly about impact. Space, on the other hand, it tends to play the long game, right? A kind of like what we're talking about. The work is,
Yeah.
I think, incredibly meaningful. There's so much that comes out of it, but the timelines are measured in decades and not sprints. And that can feel distant to someone that's just starting out. I also think that there's a feeling that the barrier to entry seems high. Whether it be security clearances, specialized degrees, long hiring cycles, all of it frustrating, all of it can make the industry feel harder to break into than maybe necessarily it is. I'd also say location and working on site versus remote plays a huge role as well. A lot of times you do have to be willing to live where the industry hubs are, and that seems currently to be less appealing for a lot of the folks getting into the field. While I personally think these places are incredible places to be and to grow a career, it's been hard to have that story. And a lot of times I want to
Yeah.
tell folks that are getting in there that, hey, when you go into some of these places, whether it be here in Colorado, whether it would be in New Orleans or Huntsville or Los Angeles, there's so much happening there that if you don't like the program you're working on, you have 12 others to choose from. They're all located next to each other. And your neighbor is probably, someone that's a rocket scientist that's doing XYZ, or a cybersecurity subject matter expert that's doing something that might really grow you as a person. And where else do we have that? I think the opportunity is really high, but we don't have that story. And I've really also, maybe as a bit of a tangent, I've seen younger hires struggle with communication skills, overall technical readiness when they're getting out of high school and in some degrees in college. And I think in some sense, they're reducing their own chances of getting hired, which is not necessarily going to have to be the case, but I do feel like that component is there where they're not interviewing, they don't have that readiness ready to go. And I think that puts people at their view of a disadvantage.
I mean, if you look back at, and you obviously see quite a few people coming out of school, do you think that's a school's failure to, prep them on that communication? Is that a lack of the home? Is it too much time on the screen? I mean, you kind of had to root cause analysis this. What do you think is contributing to that lack of preparedness from a communication and maturity perspective?
Yeah, I feel like I've seen it a lot, and I think it's pretty common nowadays across many different industries. But I can only certainly talk about the one I'm currently in and the one I was in previously. And I think there's incredible technical talent that is coming into the field. And I'm not saying, and I don't want the takeaway to be that there's no one that's young that's coming into this field. And I think what we are seeing is that people are smarter and better trained than ever. So I think that there is that component, but sometimes what I think is missing are some of those soft skills that make all that expertise that they do come in with, make it difficult for them in a real world setting. And there's things like clear communication, situational awareness, the ability to translate complex ideas to different audiences. Those are huge. You can be the best engineer in the room, but if you can't communicate your findings or collaborate across disciplines, the mission slows down, or you're not being effective. I think also from a readiness perspective, that sense of professionalism, attention to detail, and ownership, which is such a big concept for me within the division, it matters just as much as your technical ability. In space or IT, precision and accountability, going back to our very first question, they're everything. So helping
Yeah.
young folks understand that and develop those habits early on, asking good questions, following through, learning how to brief effectively. That's really what is setting a lot of folks apart. What are the root causes? I mean, I think it's hard for us to answer. I think that there is like that short-term reward aspect of I want to get a response right away, and you don't necessarily get that in a lot of industries. You have to build out, your expertise to be able to get, some of those rewards. But I think it's a good question. I think that from what I've heard, and certainly no data to fully back this up, is that we're seeing post-COVID, a lot of the folks that were in high school during COVID, they are missing a lot of the soft skills. So they are really building themselves out technically, and they're, on par, if not further ahead, probably further ahead, but they don't have the soft skills, to help them survive in business, in industry. So, I think that probably there's stuff to be studied there about why that happened. But we're definitely seeing that.
Yeah, I've got a 18-year-old son who's just started college, same thing, right? And he was definitely one of the COVID generation. And, fortunately, I think he's pretty well adjusted. But I do run into a lot of his friends who, over the years, I've kind of thought, right, this kid can't look me in the eye and shake my hand, right? How is he ever gonna, kind
Yeah.
of, be successful? And you watch them mature over time. But I noticed that as well in my industry with, a lot of young consultants coming up, and it's a tough lesson for them to learn to say, I can do an analysis and I can come to what I believe is a very, very good conclusion to that analysis, and here it is. And then it's an entirely different skill set to now put that on paper, you know, get it in a consumable fashion for an executive, distill it down to what matters, and communicate it effectively, right? And
Yeah.
and that's that's the skill set that I think certainly some kids you see from very very good schools come out with some of that polish, but most of the folks you run into, they lack that polish, right? And that situational awareness to be able to understand, what it is that my audience, needs to hear, and then what it is that ultimately you have that's going to open their eyes and enlighten them and how to present that information, right? Um, so, you talked about Huntsville, right? I've been to Huntsville. I think it's a great little town, very neat town. But how do you make it, in your opinion, right? How do you make building rockets in Huntsville, right, sound as sexy as and exciting to coding and Silicon Valley, for instance?
Yeah, and I love Huntsville. I think it's a really fascinating town. And again, there's so many programs there that are space or space adjacent, and you really have the full spectrum there of availability of the types of roles that exist. I think it's all about how we tell the story. Building rockets in Huntsville is incredibly exciting. But Silicon Valley and the IT world, if you will, has just done a better job of branding itself. I think the truth is the work that's being done in Huntsville, in Colorado, in Los Angeles, in New Orleans, it's just as innovative, it's just as technical, and honestly, to me at least, it's a lot more meaningful. But we're building things that literally leave the planet, right? I mean, how cool is that
Yeah.
concept? There's a lot of really fascinating things that happen there. But what I see with younger generations is that they really care a lot about purpose, as they should, and they want to know that their work matters. And that's exactly what I think space gives you. And if we can help connect that sense of purpose to the work that's being done in Colorado, Huntsville, New Orleans, LA, I think more people will see how inspiring the field really is. And honestly, when you're walking through a site and you see a test stand or a rocket coming together, there really is nothing like it. It's hands-on, it's cutting edge. It's a chance to see something that's much bigger than yourself. It's also not just about rockets. There's so many other fascinating facets of space that are important. Communication capabilities, Golden Dome, in-space capabilities, space domain awareness, satellites. I mean, that's just a few of the things that are being worked on in a very small space. And, as I just think that we have to be able to advertise that and show the excitement that exists in those areas, the cool things that are being built.
Yeah, I love it. I think you've got a great story. I had another um, guest on previously, and they talked about the need for talent with the concept of mechatronics, right? So kind of cross um, expertise capability, right? To be able to put the physical world together with the electronic world and the chemical world. Um, you know, you've mentioned a little bit when we talked previously, right? You mentioned you've got a few people who you've really found have found passion in very specific parts of the industry. But tell me a little bit about kind of when you think about a person's skill set and adaptation of that skill set to what it is to the mission. Um, how do you kind of connect them to the right places? How do you kind of I guess put the pieces of the puzzle together. What can be done from a human perspective with what needs to be done from a mission perspective. Can you tell me about an example when you had to step back and let a local team lead, right? And what did that teach you about influence without authority?
Sure, yeah. One example, or maybe a series of examples that really stood out to me was when I had to work very closely with partner nations and their teams. I spent months on the ground with their teams, trying to help them improve processes, problem solve, a lot of training. And at some point, I realized that I was starting to really step over that line, moving from influence into doing their work for them, which is obviously a huge no-no. And that's when I had to very consciously not only step back and let the local team take the lead, but understand, why I was doing that, and really to understand my own role. And my role, certainly in that instance, but really even now, is not to execute. It's to share best practices. It was to provide guidance. It's to offer perspective on how to adjust when challenges arose. And I think that really taught me that real influence isn't about control. It's about the enabling other, the building trust that we talked about previously, and again, creating those conditions for people to succeed. You get, I think, a lot more by stepping back and letting people closest to the problem drive the solution. And that lesson has stuck with me ever since I had those experiences. But I think it's really true, and I think we're constantly in that mode of I can do this or I can do this faster. But it's really difficult to take a step back. But I think there's a lot to be learned from the ability to do so.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great insight. Um, I'm going to move to another topic. The U.S. space economy is expected to top over 600 billion by 2030, right? That's an enormous amount of growth. Um, from your perspective, kind of where do you see the biggest growth opportunities in civil, commercial, or in formal defense? And I recognize there's a lot of kind of macro things that may shift around to influence this, but from where you sit right now, what direction do you see the winds blowing?
Yeah, it's a. I think everyone in the industry is always kind of battling with that question. And I think growth, if you look at it from a growth perspective, I think growth is really across all three areas, civil, commercial, and defense. Which I realize is a bit of a non-answer, but they're all growing in slightly different ways. Civil programs like Artemis, they're pushing the boundaries of what's technically possible, and the hope is inspiring new ideas. Commercial space is exploding with innovation and new business models, and that's where I think we're seeing a lot of the agility and speed. And defense, of course, continues to drive investment in capabilities that are then spilling into the other sectors, so that its impact is very significant. I think the real opportunity is those intersections, and I don't know if we can translate this to other industries, but it's very true within this one. When commercial innovation meets civil ambition, for example, or I guess when you go defense grade technology and it's adapted for commercial use, I think that's where those big leaps happen. And that's where we're going to see a lot of that growth. It's also where teams start to really work across the various realms. And we're seeing a lot of that happen. We're seeing the bridging of cultures, the processes that are being put together, priorities are being shifted when we work together. And I think that starts to create a ton of value for people individually, for companies that are within the industry. And again, to bring it back to us as leaders. And I think like if someone was to ask me, not that anyone is, but if someone was to ask me to advise them on what does the next decade looks like, I'd say don't pick a sector between those three. I think look for the opportunities where these spaces are overlapping, and they are overlapping all the time. And I think that's where you're going to see that growth, that learning, and really the impact.
Yeah, the other thing you mentioned when we talked before was kind of the unsexy side of space, right? where, and that's where you're also seeing a little bit of a dearth of talent, right? There may be a lot of people who are interested in, the IT side and the systems and a number of those areas. Maybe talk to me a little bit about kind of what are what are some of the unsexy parts, but just as critical as anything else. I think you had mentioned one time an adhesive engineer, right? And this guy was all about making stuff stick together, right? under all sorts of circumstances. You just talk to me a little bit about the opportunity you see maybe in those intersections that you talked about, but also in those areas where some of that core kind of capability is not as attractive to some of the younger folks.
Yeah, I think when people think about the space industry, having not been in it, they often picture, astronauts or rocket launches. That's the flashy stuff. That's obviously the stuff that makes it to the news. Totally understandable. But the reality of it is that a huge part of what makes a mission succeed comes from the so-called, unsexy work. Adhesive engineers, propulsion specialists, avionics technicians, and all the various IT experts out there. These are the people that are making sure everything actually works when it counts. It's absolutely vital because even the most advanced design or most inspiring mission, everything we talked about, it will fail if the fundamentals aren't rock solid. And these experts, they're working very quietly behind the scenes, and the entire team depends on them. And I really love pointing this out because it reinforces, I think, a much bigger lesson. Every role matters. When everyone from the niche specialists to the program managers understands their contribution is critical to the mission, that's when the team really clicks. And we see that all the time. And I think it's also really important to mention here that overall, we focus within these conversations on space engineers within a lot of these programs. But a huge component of what we do at Sev1 Tech and a major component of all the various types of space programs and projects out there is IT. The IT side is everywhere. I mean, you have secure communications, data tracking, simulation, cyber protection. None of that is visible when you think about the space programs, but without it, nothing launches and nothing operates. So these experts, again, are working quietly, but the entire mission is really depending on them.
Yeah. And so that brings up my, kind of how AI intersects with all of this, right? I mean, that it's been, it's, been a really incredibly fast launch of a technology into, never seen anything quite like this, all the way from,
Oh, yeah.
Blackberries and iPhones, to other technological innovations that you and I have seen in our past. Now that that's entering design, testing, operations, how do you kind of balance that the technological innovation with the kind of human judgment that's needed for this mission critical work, right? How do you double test? How do you make sure that the decisions and the information that you're receiving is correct? Is that kind of up to the individual to test?
Yeah, this topic around AI, you could ask me one question around AI and we could spend the next hour talking about it. I mean, I think that's kind of where mindsets are nowadays of these are such big concepts and it's moving so rapidly that I'm not sure we're fully, up with the times to figure it all out. AI is transforming a lot of what we do from design to testing, like you mentioned, to operations. And I think it's exciting. It can process data, it can run simulations faster than any human would. And that ultimately is helping our teams make better decisions. But in mission critical work, I just don't see human judgment being replaced. I think that piece is always going to continue being there. And I think, this comes to this big topic of balance. The key is balance. And we use AI to augment expertise, not to replace it. And it's a tool that really helps people to see the patterns, to test scenarios, to catch things faster, do anomaly detection. But humans are still the ones that are going to be making the final call, especially when it comes to safety or overall mission success are on the line. It also comes down to training and trust. Teams need to understand what AI is telling them, when to challenge it, and how to integrate it into their work or in their own experience. I think the best outcomes happen when technology and human judgment are working together and not in competition. And I know that's easier said than done, but I think overall I, I'm not seeing the sphere of AI within this industry as you hear on the news from other industries. I think that there really is this balance that exists of trying to utilize the tools that are available to you.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that. Why you're less fearful than other, sectors, right? Ultimately, is it just that? Is it just the, hey, I can embrace this to do my job better, but I'm not necessarily afraid of AI replacing my job, right? I mean, that's a totally different cultural embrace than I think you see out there. Maybe some of it is just media fear mongering, right? Potentially there are a lot of people who I think these days you get a lot of attention, you get a lot of likes, you get a lot of views of people if you make them scared versus getting them to embrace a different concept. I mean, but in your industry specifically, why do you think that cultural difference exists? Is it the mindset of the people?
Yeah. So, it's interesting because overall, I can't speak to jobs being replaced or not replaced in other industries, and I have no doubt that there are jobs being replaced. So this is not a blanket statement. But I think, at least within the space industry, and I think IT folks kind of across various industries are not as worried about AI because they are starting to see it as a tool and not a replacement. To not be a broken record, but I do think that it is helping people work smarter and not taking over the work that people are doing. And again, it certainly is possible that that is happening. But for a lot of the work that we're doing, it is really, assisting us. Just within our own company, I'm really happy to see that we've really leaned into exploring what AI can do for us and for our clients. And one example is a platform that we've built purely, within Sev1 Tech called Vertison, and it's a system that helps break down data silos and automate workflows. Things like cybersecurity compliance or digital twins or infrastructure management. The goal of the platform largely was to speed up a lot of the repetitive, detail-heavy work, but engineers and compliance experts are still the ones making the calls. A lot of the work that we're doing, they're utilizing the power in order to make their lives easier. I think the cool part is that it gives people more time to focus on problem solving and critical thinking instead of getting buried in administrative or data cleanup. That's why I think space teams are more comfortable with AI. They're just seeing it as a partner, not a threat. And that's really been kind of the mantra that we've adopted within the company, within the division is you have a lot of AI tools available to you. Use them. See how we can use them together.
Yeah.
And I encourage the folks that are, within the leadership structure, all the various program and project managers and operations leaders to utilize it to the best of their ability, to integrate it into their operations workflow, because it's only helping people out in their day to day.
But I think it's also very important for them to invest in, helping educate their team on how to use it, right? I think right now what I see a lot of is companies taking a backseat and saying, I'm going to see who takes the time out of their own personal time to learn how AI works and how to use the tools versus are they investing in teaching their folks about it, the fundamentals, the concepts, the different types of applications, the different types of models. And I think that's a big component of it too. But one final question. what advice would you give to a young person listening? So, say my son, who's in college in Colorado. Perhaps he dreams of joining NASA or the Artemis 2 program at some point, but maybe they doubt they're smart enough or qualified enough. What would you say to those young listeners?
Kind of maybe at a very basic level, my advice would be don't sell yourself short. I mean, I think people often assume that they're not smart enough or quality enough to work in space. But the reality is there's a place for a wide range of talents and skills. And you don't have to check every box. I think largely what we're hoping for and what we're encouraging is curiosity, perseverance, and a willingness to learn. And I think that will take you a very long way. And I think that's should be true for really all industries. And I personally really had imposter syndrome when I first started out in my career, my previous field. And it was also true when I transitioned into this field. I mean, I think that's a very normal concept when you are dealing with people who are literal rocket scientists. And what I did and what I hope others take away is focus on what excites you and where you can contribute. And I think also maybe most importantly is remember that this industry and so many industries are built on people who are passionate about the mission. If you care deeply about exploration, innovation, problem solving, that passion will carry you very far within this industry. The people I've worked with who succeed aren't just the ones who have perfect resumes. They're the ones that never stop learning, even after 40 years in this industry. And they're the ones who are committed to making this mission work. And in turn, they help their organization succeed. We're seeing this with folks kind of across the board. And I'd really encourage for folks to focus in on some of that passion and know that this industry is open to all to succeed as well.
That's great advice. And thank you for that, Leo. Thank you for an amazing discussion. Really, really appreciate all your insight. And, hope we'll have you back on someday, hear how things are going on the program. So thanks again.